For centuries, the thrones of Europe weren't just seats of incredible power, they were often cages for some serious madness. We're going to take a look at the pretty shocking history of monarchs who were, let's say, eccentric, sometimes mentally deficient, and in a few cases, truly, truly monstrous. Wow, that really sets the stage, doesn't it? Because we're not just talking about a few weird habits or quirks here. We're talking about rulers who pushed the absolute limits of human depravity, all while holding complete and total power over millions of people. So, how did this keep happening? Well, it was a lethal combination, a perfect storm of two things that should absolutely never mix: the unlimited power of a monarch and the built-in irrationality of a flawed human being.
And there was one specific thing that just threw gasoline on the fire: inbreeding. Royal families were obsessed with marrying within their own tiny circles to keep power locked down. But this created a tragic heritage of simpletons, lunatics, and deranged monarchs, and then gave them powers far beyond what they could possibly comprehend. Let's look at a few archetypes of this.
Okay, first up, we have the rulers whose madness came out as just breathtaking cruelty. These aren't your average tyrants. These are people who seem to have a genuine, deep-seated lust for violence and for making others suffer. Let's start with a name you definitely know: Vlad the Impaler, the real-life inspiration for Dracula. His title, Son of the Dragon, was, well, pretty fitting. He ruled through pure terror and became infamous for his favorite method of execution, which he basically turned into a grotesque art form. And to give you a sense of the sheer scale of his cruelty, get this. When an invading Turkish army approached his capital, they didn't find soldiers waiting for them. They found what was called a forest of the impaled, 20,000 rotting bodies stuck on stakes. The sight was so completely horrifying that the entire army just turned around and went home. And this kind of depravity wasn't just limited to the men. Countess Erzsébet Bathory was terrified of getting old, so she came up with let's call it a unique beauty regimen. She genuinely believed that bathing in the blood of virgins would keep her young. She even set up a so-called finishing school to lure girls from noble families to her castle, because she thought their blood would be more potent. Over in Russia, this sort of thing was practically state policy under Ivan the Terrible. His paranoia got so bad that he created his own personal militia, the Oprichniki. They dressed like monks, but would ride across the country terrorizing everyone, while Ivan himself would personally dream up new tortures inspired by paintings of hell, like, roasting people on giant frying pans. But not all royal madness was so sadistic. For our next group, the affliction was more of a tragic, psychological unraveling. These are rulers who were driven over the edge by obsession, paranoia, or just some deep personal tragedy. Charles VI of France is a perfect example of this. He started his reign as Charles the Well-Beloved. Everybody loved him. But then, after a mysterious illness and a bizarre encounter in a forest, he had his first psychotic break and started attacking his own men. From that day forward, he was known as Charles the Mad. And his madness got, well, weird. During one famous episode, he suffered from something called the glass delusion. He was 100% convinced that his entire body was made of glass, and he was so terrified of being touched and shattering into a million pieces that he had iron rods sewn into his clothes for protection. An obsession could also completely destroy a monarch, which is exactly what happened to Juana of Castile, better known as Juana la Loca. Her whole life revolved around her husband, Philip, who wasn't exactly faithful. When he died suddenly, her grief just consumed her. She refused to be separated from his body, traveling around with his coffin for months, and would often open it up just to hug his rotting corpse. Eventually, her own family had her declared insane and locked her away in a tower for the rest of her life. So that brings us to our final archetype. And in some ways, these are the most tragic cases of all. These are the monarchs who weren't necessarily evil monsters or figures of high drama. They were just the end product of a catastrophically broken system of royal inbreeding. The poster child for this problem has got to be Charles II of Spain. His family tree was just an absolute mess of incestuous relationships. His father was also his mother's uncle, and his great-grandmother, the very same Juana the Mad we just talked about, was also his great-great-grandmother. It was less of a family tree and more of a tangled little wreath. And the results, they were devastating. Charles, who they called the Bewitched, was born with all of these physical and mental problems that were a direct result of generations of incest.
He was so physically challenged and feeble-minded that his reign was a total disaster, and he ended up being the last Habsburg king of Spain. And this wasn't just a one-off thing. Ferdinand I of Austria, another Habsburg product, had a hugely swollen head from hydrocephalus and suffered from epilepsy. He was apparently a pretty gentle guy, but just completely incompetent. In fact, the only truly decisive order he ever gave was his famous demand, "I am the emperor and I want dumplings." So after all these horrifying and sometimes just really sad stories, you might be asking, why should we care? What's the takeaway here, beyond a bit of morbid historical gossip? Well, the real lesson is this. Every one of these rulers operated with zero checks, zero balances, and zero accountability. So it didn't matter if they were sadistic or paranoid or just incompetent, their personal failings always inevitably became national catastrophes. It really comes down to this one question. We've all heard the saying that absolute power corrupts absolutely. But these stories show us something even more terrifying. What happens when you give that absolute power to someone who's already broken from the very beginning? And that, of course, brings us to today. This dark history is a really powerful reminder of that lethal combination of human irrationality and unchecked power. And it kind of forces us to ask a pretty important question. What systems, what guardrails have we built to make sure that this kind of thing never, ever happens again?